Villains are so quickly defeated we often burn through them in comics, which means because there are so many, not all of them can be quite so fierce and memorable. Some of them inevitably end up being kinda strange and thereby forgotten. Welcome back, Nerd Squad. I'm your host Amanda McKnight, and today we'll be counting down the top 10 weirdest villains you've never heard of. You know how much I love weird things, so let's get into it. Number 10. Trapster. Oddly enough, although Trapster is a super weird and relatively obscure villain, he's still somehow made his way into a surprising number of comics. I mean, he has been around since the 60s, so considering that, I guess not so many, but we're still talking over 100 issues at least, which is pretty weird considering who Trapster is. Trapster is weird because, well, he was originally known as the guy who came armed with a glue gun, or a paste gun, if you will. Initially, he was known by the supervillain name Paste Pot Pete. However, Trapster has since come to loathe that name and much prefers to be called Trapster instead, as he feels the former name makes him sound lame and is often used out of disrespect for him. Admittedly, he is kinda lame though. Sorry Trapster, you might be a genius, but you still fight with glue. So, anyone that fights with a glue gun, I'm just saying. Although I will say if it was a hot glue gun burns do hurt a lot. Number 9. Polka Dot Man. You might think you know Polka Dot Man, but do you really know him? If you've seen the Suicide Squad, you are familiar with a version of Abner Krill, but the original Polka Dot Man, also Abner Krill of the New Earth continuity, was a little bit different when it came to his power set, at least initially. Initially, when Polka Dot Man, or Mr. Polka Dot, first appeared, he came armed with multiple different weapons which all came from the polka dots on his suit. He could pull them off and basically turn them into any means of different weapons and devices, even once turning one into a getaway vehicle. And friends, before we move on to this next spot, if you are loving this list and you want to talk more weird, obscure things from comics with me, be sure to let us know by giving this video a thumbs up. This list actually has everything that I love. Weird, obscure, and villains. I love all of those things. Number 8. Vanisher. Vanisher was actually one of the first villains that the X-Men came up against way back in X-Men issue number 2. In short, he was weird because he gave the X-Men so much trouble, especially considering Marvel Girl was on the team and he was only a teleporter. Though at this time, they'd never encountered a teleporter before and were fairly new heroes. Also, Jean likely unknowingly had mental blocks in place. Vanisher's demise was also quite dark and odd when Professor X, who had left the X-Men to fight alone initially as a test, finally came to their aid and easily defeated Vanisher by making him forget who he was, which honestly is a pretty horrifying punishment. Don't worry though, that wouldn't be the end of Vanisher, and he'd also end up getting a much less extravagant costume. Which actually is kinda sad. I do like his original costume, with its whole thing. It's very red and patterned. Number 7. Crazy Quilt. Crazy Quilt actually might sound familiar to you in terms of his overall personality and demeanor, as it seems like the version of Polka Dot Man that we saw in the Suicide Squad, to me at least, is actually closer to a combination of the original Polka Dot Man mixed with, well, this villain, Crazy Quilt. Crazy Quilt was Paul Decker, a painter and criminal who left clues in his artwork as to his criminal plots. Eventually, he was apprehended, left blinded by a gunshot wound in the scuffle. He would regain his sight through an experimental procedure where his optic nerves were attached to a helmet, but the blinding colors that he would see would cause him to go insane. At least when I was watching the Suicide Squad, I was like, this Polka Dot Man kinda reminds me of Polka Dot Man mixed with Crazy Quilt, cause he's so crazy. Number 6. Unus The Untouchable. Another villain who almost foiled the X-Men in their early days was Unus. Unus The Untouchable was a mutant who couldn't be touched by those who would do harm to him, making him seemingly invincible when he first came up against the X-Men in issue 8. His power was also weirdly specific as it didn't repel all things from him, and mainly seemed to target those who fought against him and projectiles that would do him harm. Beast was the one to help defeat him when he learned of his true nature in a wrestling match against him. This was during a brief moment when Hank McCoy left the team. When Unus turned to a life of crime, Beast was the one to stop him by creating a device that intensified his power, causing everything to be repelled from Unus, including food. Starving, Unus eventually agreed to stay on the straight and narrow, and Beast returned his power levels to how they once were, allowing Unus to return to his wrestling career. Number 5. Ruby Thursday. Ruby Thursday is a super weird villain who I still can't even really believe to this day actually exists. But she does. I believe she was kinda designed as a character on a dare, but don't quote me on that story as it's just something I remember reading somewhere. I didn't have time to go back and double check all that, but I'm pretty sure her creation story is something like someone dared hired someone to create a thing. It's a good story if you want to go check it out. Her creation is credited to Steve Gerber and Sal Buscema, and she first appeared in Defenders issue 32 in the 70s. Her whole thing is that she is a sexy villain lady, but in the place of where her head should be, she instead has a big red ball that is made up of organic circuitry and thereby gives her powers, while also acting as a stand-in head, because you still need a head to do things, so yeah. Number 4. Spook. A villain I love to talk about, but whom no one really seems to remember apparently. Val Caliban was a master escape artist who first appeared in Detective Comics back in the 70s. He was initially caught and long thought to be dead after being executed, or at least we thought he was executed, appearing in an almost ghost-inspired robe of a costume. In reality, Caliban had survived using his skills of hypnosis and escapism. He was also privy to the architectural plans of the prison as he'd worked to help design it. Thereby, he was able to exploit that knowledge and use it to escape. Honestly, it was pretty silly of them to try to put him in a prison that he'd designed, in my opinion. Years later though, he wouldn't be so lucky when changes had been made to its design and he ended up back in the prison again. And he'd be even more unlucky when he ran into Damian Wayne. It's Damian Wayne. Number 3. Gaggy. Gaggy was the sidekick of Joker. Before there was Harley Quinn, there was Gaggy. Although to be clear, Joker and Gaggy were not in a romantic relationship. Just thought I'd point that out. They were simply partners in crime. In fact, when Harley did start coming around, it was later revealed that Gaggy actually became jealous of her, and even that she was perhaps the reason for Gaggy's fall from glory in the Joker's eyes. At least that was how Gaggy saw it. He basically blamed Harley for all of it. More recently, Gaggy made a reappearance in the Batman 3 Jokers limited series, but sadly, he was killed off in that book, being eaten by a Joker shark. R.I.P. Gaggy. I love how Gaggy came back and then they were like, he's dead. I was like, oh, okay. Bye. Number 2. Tatterdemalion. Tatterdemalion is by all accounts a pretty weird and obscure villain who at one point was stopped by Dazzler. He doesn't really have any powers but instead has some kind of forgotten skills, possibly. He started out initially as a tap dancer who found fame in the movies with his dancing partner Julia Walker. Knowing eventually his star would dim, he invested money in a casino in Las Vegas, but later, after he retired to run it, was swindled out of his investment and money by criminals. Following that, he became a derelict and ended up allied with the committee. He eventually would become the crazed criminal Tatterdemalion, who sought to destroy money and material possessions as a means of revenge for what had unfairly happened to him. Honestly, it seems pretty fair of him to go that route. Eventually, Daz stopped him and helped to reunite him with his former dance partner Julia Walker, but eventually she would grow tired of looking after him. Which also, fair. Number 1. Snowflame. Snowflame was originally a villain that first appeared in the 80s in DC Comics, making his first appearance in New Guardians issue number 2, and coincidentally, his last appearance as well, in the New Earth continuity anyways. Snowflame's powers are fueled by drugs, which grant him superhuman speed, strength, pyrokinesis, and made him numb to pain. He could also infect other people, intoxicating them merely by touching them. And guess what? There's more. It gets better. In 2020, he actually made a return in the Prime Earth continuity, appearing in the 2018 Catwoman series in issue number 23. So while he still remains obscure, he's also kind of recently renew as well. Yay. Who do you think are some of the weirdest villains around? Who are some of your favorite obscure villains? Which lesser known villains do you wish would return? Let us know in the comments below. And speaking of comments, it's time to turn to some comments from one of our latest videos from our newest channel, Top 10 Nerd Elite. These are some comments from our greatest supervillain couples list. CEARJR7 comments, Amanda, you are gorgeous. Taylor, you are cool AF. Together you guys make the best host couple. Aw, thank you. That's such a nice comment. I like that. I'm also going to tell Taylor about that one too. Jared Quinney responds, interesting. Indeed, it is quite interesting. Lots of cool supervillain couples. I love a good supervillain couple that can get together and like take over the world together, especially as there's quite a few like really strangely healthy supervillain couples. Then again, there's a lot of unhealthy supervillain couples too, so. Micah Parham confirms, hashtag I stan Amanda. Oh thanks, that's nice. You can join my little fan club of, I don't know, little vampire babies. I don't know what I call my people. The McKnights? I think that's what they go by. Thank you. And that's all the time we have for comments today. Be sure to head on over to Top 10 Nerd Elite, smash that subscribe, and say hi with a comment for a chance to have your thoughts and questions responded to in a future video. This has been Top 10 Nerd, and I'm your host Amanda McKnight, reminding you as always to stay nerdy, YouTube.